Thank you so much. Can you hear me all right? Perfect. Thank you for this wonderful, where's the timer, by the way? Good. Thank you for this invitation to this wonderful building. I absolutely have enjoyed just walking around. I'm excited to tell you a little bit about some work that I've been doing in the past couple of years, and excited to hear your questions. Broadly, I'm interested in how our brains form representations that enable learning, memory, and planning at different scales. Interested both in spatial navigation and non-spatial tasks, but for simplicity, I'll mostly use spatial examples. This goes back to the tradition of cognitive maps, going back to the early 20th century, where learned representations of relational structures can be formed in a rodent, for instance, in the famous Tolman experiments, in the absence of reinforcement, which went against the behaviorist dogma of the time. And following up on that, about 30 years later, place cells were discovered by O'Keeffe, and about 30 years after that, grit cells by the Mosers. Within that tradition, what I have sort of added to this is this planning or this representational hierarchy along the long axis of the hippocampus as well as the prefrontal cortex that support planning hierarchies for short scale and long scale plannings. And I'll give you some examples. Here are some of the papers in case you'd like to take a look, and I'll go through some of them during this talk. The approach that I use is reinforcement learning. And this is an approach in which, given a task or a goal in an environment, an agent learns a sequence of actions known as a policy, and it maximizes expected value, which is defined as a discounted cumulative reward over future states. The interesting thing is that you can sort of abstract any problem into a grid world structure where actions are as simple as left, right, up, down, and a policy is a sequence of actions. Optimal policy is one that is the shortest path that gets you to the goal. And you can have options, which are abstracted policies that could be realized in different sequences or different policies, and also eigenoptions, which I will not talk about in this talk. This approach is neurally plausible and enables abstraction, hierarchy, generalization, and transfer, and can be compared across artificial and biological agents, which is why I'm particularly interested in it. The approach that I use in my research is, first, I define specific tasks. And with these tasks, some of which that are defined in terms of a graph, some in terms of a grid world, we can compare behavior on the same tasks between artificial and biological agents. And what do I mean by behavior? I mean accuracy, reaction times, as well as errors. So if something is doing better than biological agents, it's not a very good model of that biological agent. So doing superhuman is not interesting for me. I'm actually interested in models that make similar errors to humans. Then, once we figure out which models are good candidates, we can look under the hood and see what kind of representations these models learned and compare that to the representations we measured in human brains, in my case, with both fMRI and electrophysiology. So first, a little bit about what I mean by predictive cognitive maps. Imagine that I'm flying from New York City to Lisbon. I can plan this at a very high level of abstraction or at very detail. What would the cognitive maps I use look like? One option, which is very common in model-based RL, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it shortly, is that we have a one-step association map. And at the moment of decision-making, we basically unroll one step at a time, every step from a location that we start until the end. As you can imagine, if I was doing that, I would still be sitting in Brooklyn and imagining what it would take to come to Lisbon. Another possibility is that we have some abstracted multi-step representations that we can unfold at different scales in order to plan. It's very close to the idea of successor representations, or an extension of the idea of successor representations by Peter Dayan. So let's frame our question in terms of this example. What learning algorithms enable human-like flexible behavior? What do I mean by that? If the coffee cart moves in the airport, I can manage to still get my coffee and not miss my flight. And in New York City, subway lines sometimes swap, and I have to be mindful of that. Somehow we manage to do that, not always and not all of us, but sometimes we manage to do that. So the first problem is known as reward revaluation, when the reward structures of the world can change. And transition structures can change, for instance, when the subway lines swap. And I will show you why it matters to test behavior of algorithms on both of them. So the first reinforcement learning candidate algorithm, let's look at model-free reinforcement learning. This is an algorithm where value of a state is learned after you take an action, you observe the rewards, and see another state by some learning rate, and a prediction error. And you keep updating your initial value based on your learning rate and the prediction error, which is basically the reward you observe and the difference between the discounted value of the next state and what you expected currently. This only caches expected value, so it has no map. Therefore, if something in the map changes, it can't adapt. Therefore, it's not flexible in the sense that we had in mind. And it can't reevaluate if rewards or maps partially change. It needs to go back from the start and experience everything from the get-go in order to be able to update. So it can't do the examples that we were mentioning. The prediction error it uses is the reward prediction error that was mentioned in one of the most famous neuroscientific articles. Model-based reinforcement learning, on the other hand, learns a one-step transition map of the environment and a vector of rewards. This combination allows the one-step map of the world to be able to be super flexible, but very slow. Why? Because if this was the world and I needed to figure out if I need to take the station at location 1 or 2 in order to get the maximum reward, I would need to iterate, go 1 to 3, 2 to, or then 3 to 5, and see how much value there is for 5, 2 to 4, and then 4 to 6. As you can see, this is time-consuming. And the equation looks something like this. You just have to maximize what you iterate over the probability of going from some state, taking some action to another state, and the discounted expected future value of the next state that you just ended up in, and iterate this over time and sum it up. Successor representations, on the other hand, have this beautiful advantage that you can just generalize over a couple of these states in a row. For instance, you have a multi-step map that is policy-dependent. That's why I have this pi, and I'll show you at some point what that means. And it has a discount parameter, gamma, which says how far into the future am I going to kind of abstract over. And then you separately have the rewards. What this does is that at the moment of decision, I can just do a linear combination of the two in order to get my value, and therefore I don't need to do iterations to compute value. It's a little less flexible, but it has these beautiful properties. For instance, its rows tell you who are the successors of the state 2, for instance, and the columns tell you who are the predecessors of a state. So in a manner of speaking, the rows speak to the future and the columns speak to the past, which are desirable properties for a structuring of memory of the world. Another wonderful property is that you can learn these successor representations with temporal difference learning, but not temporal difference learning of value, but temporal difference learning of successors. So it's very similar to what you saw for model free, other than instead of value, you have the successor representation. Instead of reward, you have the one hot of S prime, which means just counting how many times I arrived at S prime. So I'm basically counting the expected discounted value of, the expected discounted occupation of state S prime, given I started in state S. But importantly, I also inherit the discounted future or successors of S prime. So if I'm here, I visit this location, I don't only learn that I can come here, I also learn that with some discounted with some discount, I'm also inheriting all of the successors of S prime, because those are now in my future as well. So this kind of prediction error is, that is successor prediction error and not reward prediction error, is something that's based on the structure of the world and not the rewards. So this, going back to Tolman, can be also very good for explaining latent learning, in which reinforcement is not necessary for the rodent to learn the structure of the world. Other nice properties is that, as Kim showed earlier in her talk, the columns of the successor representation have been shown to be associated with simulating place cells. The eigenvector of the successor representation matrix simulates grid fields. And we have shown with Mark Howard that if you have stacked multi-scale successor representations, their derivative shows you distance to goal, which has been shown in the hippocampus of bats and the entorhinal cortex of humans. Just to show you side by side again, this is the one-step map and the iteration. Again, rewards and the map are separate. And this is a multi-step map, and the rewards and the simple linear combination. And the important thing, I guess, in these ones that I want you to take away is that this takes a lot more time to compute. So at the moment of decision, it's slower. Although it's much more accurate, it's not efficient computationally, especially for larger trees, like me coming from New York City to Lisbon. I can't just sort of iterate everything. And also, so if I need to run away from a predator, it might not be very appropriate. Another thing is that SR has a caveat. It needs to go back to the beginning to learn directly from experience again, because it's using temporal difference learning. But inspired by an algorithm from Rich Sutton called the DINA algorithm, where the model-free learner is being updated with the model-based via offline replay, I proposed this idea of SR-DINA, or dinosaur if you like, which learns both through experience and through replay. So instead of updating the model-free, it updates the successor representation, and instead of updating from model-based necessarily, it can use model-based, or it can use just episodic memory in order to replay and update this. So in this way, it doesn't need to go back to the start. It can use replay to update the successor representation. Okay, now, which model prediction produces human-like behavior? Recall that reward structures can change, and this is how we simulated it in the experiment. You go, the person learns over a number of practice trials during their learning, which one of these two they should prefer. Then during relearning, they no longer go to 1 or 2, and they're just in the middle locations. You can see here that, for instance, in reward evaluation, the values have changed. And then in the test phase, we ask them, which one do you want to choose, 1 or 2? So if the person, maybe I ask for audience participation very quickly. So if the person can solve it correctly, at this point, they should choose 1. What should they choose at this point in phase 3? Yes, 2. And if they are just remembering what they did before, but they haven't updated it, so model-free who hasn't gone from the beginning, it wouldn't be able to do it. Both model-based and successor representation can do it. Why? Because the reward vector has changed, but the map hasn't changed. So that's very easy for both of them to do. Now, what if the transition structure changes? And what that means is that, just like the subway lines might swap, 3 now goes to 6, and 4 now goes to 5. So this is the structure of the experiment. And then I ask you, again, in the beginning, 1 was better, and in phase 3, if I ask you 1 is better or 2, you say 2 again. And in this case, this is what has changed in the MDP. For instance, this is like when the A train is running on F in New York City. Successor representation without replay cannot solve this. Why? Because it has grandfathered a relationship between 1 and 5 from earlier stages that it has not updated yet. Why? Because it didn't go back to 1. But if it can update things using offline replay, using, for instance, SR-DINA or dinosaur, then it could sort of update its successor representations on the basis of the replaying of the virtual trajectories. So predictions. One-step model-based would do equally well on both. SR without replay will not do as well, and SR-DINA will do both well, but it would be a little worse at transition evaluation. And this is the behavior of humans. As you can see, it fits with the SR-DINA approach. And this is the control where nothing changes. You want to make sure they are not just forgetting things. And here, they are consistently doing what they were doing before, so it shows that they are actually correct. On the y-axis, you see revaluation score, where 0 means they didn't change their behavior from phase 1 to phase 3. And on 1, it would be if they completely changed it, and the average is displayed here. And the reaction, so somebody might say, hey, this might be a speed-accuracy trade-off. Maybe they were just slower for the reward evaluation, and that's why they were more accurate. We see the opposite pattern. In fact, they took longer in order to solve the transition evaluation. And there is a positive correlation between how much time they spent and how accurate they were at transition evaluation. So in short, human behavior seems to be consistent with SR-DINA and not any of the other reinforcement learning models that we considered. All right. We also showed that SR-DINA is normatively more efficient than DINA in terms of how it can solve, for instance, the latent learning Tolman problem or detour problem with the insufficient number of samples, with very low number of samples. Okay, we showed that behavior seems to check out for our algorithm. Let's compare its representations. So in this case, let's take a look at some single-cell recordings with depth electrodes in epileptic patients who we are fortunate to have a laptop in front of them where they can play this game. Could you please play the video? Control room. Thank you. So the patient will see a video like this, and then they open a door. The speed is varied, as you can imagine, those of you who work on hippocampus, so that we're not confusing speed with representation of location. And there are different rooms with different colors, so it's different contexts. They don't sort of confuse them or generalize them. And they open the reward, and they see that. The experiment is very much similar to the paradigm that I showed you earlier. So there are these rooms, and then there is reward and transition evaluation on different trials. And then they're asked which starting room is more likely to give you more rewards at the end. So that's how we ask them. It's like the question of, is one better or two? And then we can ask, is a successor representation reflected in neural similarity patterns? And to do that, I just take all of the cells, and 14 cells in this patient was a very good patient. We usually have less. And I can take the cells, average the cell firing rate when the presentation is in the room, and then take this vector of all of the averages of cells in one room, and then do a correlation between that and the same vector in another room. That allows me to form this matrix of similarity. And then I can hypothesize what would happen if a transition evaluation happens and the structure of the environment changes. In which case, this is what I would predict it would look before, for instance. Oh, this is actually the recordings. This is what it would look before, and this is what it would look after. So before is here, and after is here, after they have learned this phase. And what is this? This says how similar would be the representation of room 1 to room 3 and room 1 to room 5. Why would we expect this? Because the successor representation postulates that the cells in the hippocampus would look a little bit like their successors. Or when I'm in a particular location, place fields in the hippocampus will fire in a way that it doesn't only represent one location, but some of the locations of the successors. So place fields are going to be skewed towards the direction I tend to go, or I want to go. The hypothesis matrix would be that if I subtract those two, then I will get an increase in similarity, for instance, between room 1 and 3 and room 1 and 6, and a decrease in similarity, for instance, between room 1 and 5 and room 1 and 4. I hope the logic is clear. I'm happy to explain it in more detail if it's not. And that's exactly what we see. So this is, on the y-axis, you see changes in multivariate pattern similarity between the representation of cells in room 1 and room 3. You can see it's increasing. 4 decreased a little bit. And you can see that this is the one step. So it's not super surprising. But for the multi-step, we can see that, for instance, 1 used to be close to 5, and now it leads to 6, and this similarity has decreased, and 1 to 6 has increased, and the difference between them is actually significant. So with that, it seems like we have confirmed the hypothesis that hippocampal cells code a successor map, or have some small amount of human data that is in line with this hypothesis. Okay, what about fMRI? Also, do findings in these experiments with small MDPs scale to large distances in city VR? So I used this beautiful experiment that was done by Maurice Moscovich in Toronto, where they had subjects line the scanner and navigate their own city, which was Toronto. And through this, they had two conditions. Either they were going to a location they knew, or they were navigating using a GPS arrow that was telling them which way to go, this one, and they didn't know where they were going. The hypothesis was that predictive representations that were learned at different scales would be activated. For instance, when I know where I'm going, we would expect that longer scale predictions would be activated in the brain. And if I don't know where I'm going, shorter scales predictions, but not longer term representations. And the hypothesis, based on some of my earlier work and work in the field, was that the long axis of the hippocampus, as well as the rostral axis of the prefrontal cortex, would sort of mediate this effect. Falling. And so we tested this by looking at the pattern similarity in a particular location and discounted expected occupancy within a particular smaller horizon or a longer horizon. Predictive horizons were from 0 meters to 1 kilometer, corresponding to different gammas or scales. As you remember, it was in the equations for the successor representation. And what we see, long story short, is that when you are planning and you're goal-directed, you know where you're going, then you can see representational similarity to future horizons that go up to 1 kilometer, whereas when you're using GPS, you mostly see it up to, let's say, 300 meters, which are the cases where you can see actually that amount. So that similarity might be simply because you can see that area in front of you. So this was a very fortunate finding, because this region in the anterior prefrontal cortex, or Brodmann area 10, is a region that I have found in my earlier work as well. In the context of prospective memory, my PhD work. All right, I am going to skip this last one and just go to the conclusion. So it seems like the successor representation might offer a general principle for memory organization. This is our work that I have shown you, but there are other works showing this in temporal context memory, sub-goal setting, and statistical learning. If you have any questions about the navigation Turing test or fMRI of replay, please ask me. I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to stop here and look forward to your questions. Thank you.